The Presidency armies were the armies of the three presidencies of the East India Company's rule in India, later the forces of the British Crown in India. The Presidency armies were named after the presidencies: the Bengal Army, the Madras Army, and the Bombay Army. Initially, only Europeans served as commissioned and non-commissioned officers. In time, Indian Army units were garrisoned from Peshawar in the north, to Sindh in the west, and to Rangoon in the east. The army was engaged in the wars to extend British control in India and beyond. The Presidency armies, like the presidencies themselves, belonged to the company until the Indian Rebellion of 1857, when the Crown took over the company and its three armies. In 1895, the three Presidency armies were merged into a united Indian Army. Origin: the origin of the British Indian Army and subsequently the Army of Independent India lies in the origins of the Presidency armies which preceded them. The first purely Indian troops employed by the British were watchmen employed in each of the presidencies of the British East India Company to protect the trading stations. These were all placed in 1748 under one Commander-in-Chief, Major General Stringer Lawrence, who is regarded as the father of the Indian Army. For the mid-18th century, the East India Company began to maintain armies at each of its three main stations, or presidencies of British India, at Calcutta, Madras and Bombay. The Bengal Army, Madras Army, and Bombay Army were quite distinct, each with its own regiments and cadre of European officers. All three armies contained European regiments in which both the officers and men were Europeans, as well as a larger number of native regiments, in which the officers were Europeans and the other ranks were Indians. They included artillery, cavalry and infantry regiments, so historical sources refer to the Bengal, Madras, Bombay artillery, cavalry, infantry. For the mid-18th century onwards, the Crown began to dispatch regiments of the regular British Army to India, to reinforce the company's armies. These troops are often referred to as H.M.'s regiments or Royal Regiments. By 1824, the size of the combined armies of Bengal, Madras, and Bombay was about 200,000 and had at least 170 sepoy and 16 European regiments. Regimental Organization. In 1757, Robert Clive came up with the idea of sepoy battalions for the Bengal Presidency, which were to be armed, dressed and trained as the Redcoats and commanded by a nucleus of British officers. The Madras Army followed suit with 6 battalions in 1759, followed by the Bombay Army in 1767. Recruitment in all cases was done locally amongst single castes, from specific communities, villages and families. Regular cavalry regiments were raised in 1784, of which only 3 survived the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Irregular cavalry were raised based on the indigenous system of raising cavalry by rulers of Indian states called the Siladar system. Irregular cavalry regiments had very few British officers. In addition, native artillery and pioneers were also raised. Between 1796 and 1804, a regimental system on 2-battalion basis was introduced. The battalions were only theoretically linked together and shared no esprit de corps. The number of British officers went up to 22 per battalion, which led to the diminished importance of native officers. The control by the regimental commander was excessive and exasperating to its battalions, and the system was reverted in 1824, with units being formed into single battalion regiments with numbering as per the seniority of raising. After 1857, Following the Indian Rebellion of 1857 and the consequent abolition of the East India Company, its European regiments were amalgamated in 1860 with the British Army, but its native regiments were not. The three separate presidency armies therefore continued to exist, and the European officers continued to be listed as members of the Bengal, Madras or Bombay Army rather than the British Army. However, the presidency armies began to be described collectively as the Indian Army. Another change resulting from the Indian Rebellion of 1857 was that henceforward artillery was confined to the British Army. In 1895, the separate presidency armies were at last abolished and a fully unified Indian Army came into being. As before, its British officers were not members of the British Army, though as young subalterns they did serve for a year with the British Army Regiment as part of the training before taking up permanent commissions with their Indian Army Regiment. Operational history of the presidency armies. Mysore Wars. First Anglo-Mysore War, Second Anglo-Mysore War, Third Anglo-Mysore War, Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, Maratha Wars. First Anglo-Maratha War, Second Anglo-Maratha War, Third Anglo-Maratha War, Burmese Wars. First Anglo-Burmese War, Second Anglo-Burmese War, Third Anglo-Burmese War, Afghan Wars. First Anglo-Afghan War, Second Anglo-Afghan War. See also, the Great Game and European influence in Afghanistan for a more detailed description. Opium Wars. First Opium War, Second Opium War, Sikh Wars. First Anglo-Sikh War, Second Anglo-Sikh War, Abyssinia Expedition to Abyssinia. List of presidencies and armies.